This video looks at American music of the 60s from the Beach Boys through Black Pop and Bob Dylan. Formed in 1961 in Southern California, the Beach Boys quickly gained popularity for singing about girls and surfing and cars, and also for their close vocal harmonies. By close vocal harmonies, I mean that the group would sing homophonic textures that consisted of chords with notes that are relatively close to each other. You can also hear close vocal harmonies in doo-wop music of the late 50s and 60s, so for example in the Drifters, and also in barbershop quartet music for that matter. What some of you may not realize, however, is that the Beach Boys were great innovators of recording techniques as well. Led by Brian Wilson, the most musically ambitious of the group, they were some of the first to use 8-track recording. Like the Beatles, once they had established their name, they spent much of their time in the studio releasing albums. The Beach Boys' 11th album, Pet Sounds, was one of the most influential albums of the 1960s. Paul McCartney of the Beatles, for one, has talked and written a lot about how influential it was on them as a group. They would, of course, release Sgt. Pepper's in the following year. Using only the best studio musicians, the instrumentals for Pet Sounds were recorded over a 4-month period using state-of-the-art 8-track recorders. The single Wouldn't It Be Nice, the opening tune on the album, is a good example of how the Beach Boys merged lighthearted words with sophisticated musical values. Make sure to study it along with a listening guide on the course website. By the mid-1960s, Detroit, or Motown, was the center of black pop. There were influential black pop groups before this time, as we have already seen with the Drifters. And, as we'll see shortly, black pop continued to be recorded on the coasts and would gain southern centers at Stax Records in Memphis and at the Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. But Motown would come to dominate not only black pop, but also a large portion of pop for white audiences. Motown music, in fact, has sometimes been referred to as black pop for white audiences. Producer Berry Gordy was at the center of Motown and at the center of groups such as Diana Ross and the Supremes. You might recognize this group not only from Diana Ross, but also because it was used as the historical inspiration for the 2006 fictional film Dreamgirls. For Berry Gordy, the image of his musicians was as important as the music that they performed. His groups were put through rigorous charm school so that they might meet every social and musical challenge with sophistication. Gordy used the songwriting trio of Holland, Dozier, and Holland, much like Alden Music had used the brill-building songwriters such as Carole King and Jeffrey Goffin. Holland, Dozier, and Holland were paid to drum out tunes that would be assigned to different groups that he was managing. One of their greatest hits was My Girl, as performed by the Temptations. Make sure to listen to it with your listening guide. The map on your screen plots the location of the Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and of Stax Records in Memphis. The rhythm section in Muscle Shoals had really made a name for itself by the 1950s. By the late 50s, you see them pictured there in front of the Fame Studios. Large producers from the coasts, such as Atlantic Records, would send their artists to this very small studio to record with the rhythm section. This group of mostly white musicians who played rhythm and blues music were sometimes known as the Swampers. Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, was another dominant voice of the 1960s. Raised in Detroit, the daughter of famous black preacher Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha grew up around music and was already singing solos at her father's New Bethel Baptist Church as a teenager. She got additional performance experience as she toured with her father on his preaching circuit, and then she signed her first contract with Columbia Records in 1960. 6 years later, in 1966, she switched to Atlantic Records, where she hit it off with Jerry Wexler. With them, she covered Otis Redding's song Respect, R-E-S-T-P, and this was almost immediately a #1 hit, both on the pop charts and on the R&B charts. It earned her a Grammy that year. Aretha Franklin has a huge voice and a very colorful voice, so make sure you listen to it with your listening guide and on your playlist. Although we haven't had a chance to talk about it in any detail, as I have mentioned, the 1960s saw a folk music revival, especially among students in their late teens and 20s. Important groups included the Kingston Trio, the Weavers, Peter, Paul and Mary, and of course, 2 seminal singer-songwriters, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. Dylan, born in northern Minnesota in 1941, found himself in New York City as a young man, singing folk songs for the Greenwich Village crowd. In 1962, he wrote and performed the song Blowing in the Wind there, and he released it on an album in 1963. Within just weeks, others were covering this song. It's one of the most covered songs out there. Peter, Paul and Mary's version hit #2 on one of the Billboard charts. After you've listened to Dylan sing Blowing in the Wind on the YouTube playlist, do check out his Positively 4th Street. In order to hear him sing it, you'll have to go to your listening guide. This is one of the first tunes that Dylan did with his electric guitar, and he brought out the electric guitar with great flamboyance and with great controversy at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1965. The lyrics of the song are somewhat cryptic, but a lot of people have heard in it Dylan's complaint against the hypocrisy of his fans who turned on him as soon as he embraced the electric guitar. Influenced by Dylan and by hardcore folkies such as Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, rock groups such as the Byrds incorporated folk tunes and lyrics into their music. Listen to the Byrds cover Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man with your listening guide. Note its jingle jangle timbres, which are created with the group's 12-string Rickenbacker guitars. Here are 3 review questions for you before we move on to the 1970s. So now's a good time to pause your video and find the answers to the questions. Okay, so Berry Gordy was the leader of Motown Records. Muscle Shoals Rhythm section was at residence at the Fame Studios, and then it moved to another studio, but it started there. And of course, Positively 4th Street was one of Dylan's first plugged-in folk songs. See you in the 70s.